Good evening. These questions are taken from an archive of questions that students and devotees ask from time to time. Our first question is, we live in very challenging times where our rights are being stripped away and wealthy people in power want to change how we live and what it means to be human. COVID-19 has ushered in a massive state of fear and global tyranny. Some of us just want to strangle the ignorant sheep and evildoers who are perpetrating what many are calling fascism. And yet, you are calling for people to spread love and light and extend compassion to those who want to control us. Maybe you can do this because of all the work that you've done on yourself, but what about the rest of us? How can you expect people to be compassionate in today's times when there is so much evil in the world?
Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to address is, I suppose in one way, because I chose to follow a particular discipline, that it could be said that I've done a lot of work on myself. But in truth, I would have to say that God has worked on me. I would have to say that my spiritual guru has worked on me. And yes, there was instruction in a particular discipline that I had to decide to take up, and that's part of the work. But I had the privilege of being worked on, is really the way I have to put it. And that's really the foundation for my transformation, even though without my own self-effort, of course, it could not have happened. So just wanted to share that first. So much evil in the world. So, if we really dig down historically with respect to what has occurred, particularly in cycles, I call these cycles of purging, but cycles where it appears that evil is reigning over good, as it does appear to be today. I like to use that word appearance because there's always something else going on that people need to be aware of. But I'll acknowledge that it does appear that evil is triumphing over good. What people have to remember is that even historically, there has never been a time on this planet where there's been more evil than love. That's just not true. Whenever there is evil that appears to be spreading collectively through societies, then mainstream media, popular media, and collectively masses through fear, they begin just to focus on evil. And then the next notion is, well, everything's evil and everybody's evil. But this is not true, and it's never been true. Wherever there has been evil and cycles of the expression of these kinds of tendencies, there has always been more love. There has always been more love present on the planet than there has been evil, even in times where it appears temporarily that evil is reigning over good. This has always been the case. God's love reigns here. It will always be the case that even though evil may raise its ugly head from time to time, there will always be more available love than evil. This is part of sacred law. It has always been this way. It will always be this way. So having said that, yes, it appears that evil is triumphing over good under COVID, but it appears that way. And now people want to know, well, who's responsible? Somebody's got to be held accountable. What about liability? Nobody's liable. There's so much chaos. Well, these are very good questions to contemplate with one goal. Liability also means responsibility. And so if we're concerned about circumstances and situations developing under COVID, And we're calling the things that are connected and evolving out of emergency mandates, for example, et cetera, transgressions of our constitutional rights, violations of natural law and common law. Yes, this is happening, but we've allowed it to happen, and we don't have to allow it to happen. So that's something that we have to remember, that if evil has festered to the point where it's now out in the open, that's usually a long cycle that has only been allowed to manifest because we have been complacent as a society. And the big deal today is that people for so many years have traded in truth for convenience. And now it's caught up with us. This has been the case for decades that people have been doing this. People have been turning their backs on transgressions by government here in the US, for example, by big business here in the US. This is not new. This has been developing for centuries. We've had assassinations of presidents. We've had assassinations of human rights leaders in this country, civil rights leaders, and the public has not demanded answers. People have turned their backs in fear, hoping that one day it will all go away. So we are in part, if we want to hold people to liability, we have to know that inherent in that is responsibility, which means we have to look at ourselves and first ask, how did things get so bad? What are the events that led up to what's taking place today? And if we look at it this way, we will see that there has been a history where, due to people's trading in truth for convenience, the public and the masses, and this is all over the world now, have turned their backs on transgressions that have mounted over a period of many, many years. And now the whole thing has just caught up with us. People are now saying, well, this is too much, but this has been developing for a very long time with anything that's happening under COVID. So we are responsible. Compassion and love. I was saying that there's never been a time where there's been more evil in the world than love, and that's true. Why is that true? Love, without distinctions, is an inherent part of our nature. Here in our school, we refer to it as God nature, to which is connected a God power that we also refer to as the energy substratum of everything, taking that term also from quantum physics. We are all equal in our God nature. And that God nature, inherent in it, are spiritual principles. And love is a spiritual principle that is an unending part of our nature. And compassion is something that manifests out of that love that we are. So everyone is capable of extending love and compassion, everyone on the planet, because it's part of our nature. Even people who appear to be the worst of evildoers because they're misguided, we have to look more closely. And so let me give you some examples. When I was doing community policing in New York City, there were several circumstances where I came up against mobsters. These were mafiosos who were very high up in the largest organized crime families in the world. And they had their offices downtown in New York City. And I had several clashes with them because they were participating in financing the drug cartels that were dealing on the streets in the neighborhood, for which I had assembled block patrols, working with police and undercover cops. And so I had several run-ins. My life was threatened. I was told that my head was going to be cut off, my fingers were going to be chopped off, my body parts were going to be placed in garbage cans all over New York City. Many threats like this. But what I can tell you from some of my contact with these mobsters, when I observed them in interaction with their own families, which I had on a couple of occasions, the opportunity to observe, all I saw was it was like they weren't mobsters. They were very loving toward their children. I saw this behavior with my own eyes. So loving, so gentle with their kids and with their wives. These are people who otherwise, in a different setting, were total monsters. But it was very clear to me that they had the ability to express love and compassion, even though they embraced evil. So that's one example I can give. Another example I can give is that here in our school, we have a prison project, and I work directly with inmates in prisons on the West Coast. And these inmates, most of them are in for life. And the first thing I do is I ask them, well, what are you in for? And each and every one, with one exception, the rest of them, serious crimes. The one who's making uh, the greatest strides is in for killing police officers. He was a gangbanger who sold drugs and dealt in arms on the street, trading guns. And then he was a hired assassin to shoot police officers. And that's what he's in for. He killed several police officers. And so this is a heinous crime. But what I've observed in this individual is that when he talks about his family and his children, it's like I'm talking to a different person. That veneer of being a gangbanger and having to demand respect through violence disappears entirely. It's very clear in my interactions with these inmates that they have the capacity to love and to also extend compassion. And so, we who are on a spiritual journey, of course, one of our duties is to be able to heighten that expression, to be able to express love and compassion to a greater and greater extent, that innate principle that we are. But even for people who are not making a spiritual journey, still, these principles are innate in them. And there are certain circumstances where we can observe that they are capable, as evil as they may appear to be. Let me give you another example. I was out with my brother and my mother. I was very young. We were traveling through the Midwest. We got stuck in a huge snowstorm. It was so bad, we had to pull the car over. And then while we were parked on the side of the road, the wind and the snow built this huge snowdrift that enveloped the entire car. We couldn't see anything. We didn't know whether we were going to be able to continue breathing. We tried to open doors. The doors were frozen. My mother started screaming. We started screaming, hoping that maybe someone would drive by and hear our voices coming from this snowdrift. And we were praying to God and screaming like mad. And about 45 minutes later, we heard somebody with a shovel banging on the snowdrift, attempting to dig us out. Somebody in a truck. And we were out in, I forget the exact state, but this was a cowboy. And he didn't have to stop. He could have said, no way, my life is also in danger. I'm going to keep going. But he stopped. He got out of his truck. He dug the car out of the snowdrift enough to get the doors open, pulled us out to safety, and then took us to a hotel and paid for a hotel room for us overnight until we could get some help the next day to get the car out. And so it was a great act of love and compassion. And then many months later, this person became a close friend of my mom's. And then she found out he was a petty criminal. That this guy was a street thug. And that's how he made his living. And, gradually, as they became closer and closer friends, he divulged this. And he had been on the run in the state from police. So here's a guy who's a criminal who also had enough love and compassion to risk his own life to dig us out of a snowdrift. And so everyone has a heart, even those who are not committed to a spiritual path or making the spiritual journey, in certain circumstances, are able to experience the true heart. This is the spiritual heart. This is the highest spiritual center. And they're able to act accordingly because automatically love flows in that way. Automatically, compassion is able to manifest when we focus on our God nature in this way. And I've just given you 3 examples of people who, by all observations and judgments of society, they were just hardened criminals. And some people would say they're useless, they're evildoers, and yet they're capable of love. And I saw that and experienced it. And they're capable of compassion. And I saw that and experienced that. So, so much evil in the world. How can I expect people to be compassionate? We are at a huge turning point in our existence here that I do feel is engineered by God. We are being called to make a decision right now amidst this COVID pandemic, and I do know that it's a pandemic and not a pandemic. That's a conversation for another time. But we are in a turning point where we are being called by God to make a decision. Are we going to set the example of love and light that others can model after in the expression also of fearlessness? Or are we going to continue to perpetuate hate, anger, and revenge? And so when I call people to spread love and light, when we sit for meditation, whenever we chant, particularly as a group or even individually, whenever we perform japa, repeating God's name in the form of mantras, whenever we perform selfless service, truly to serve others without any attachment to outcomes, we are emitting a subtle but powerful frequency that changes our environment. When you sit for meditation each and every day in one particular room in your home, for example, you are gradually increasing the vibration and the Shakti power in that room. And so I experienced this because the more I sat and meditated in a particular space, the easier it was to fall into meditation after a while when I went back to that spot, because this power had developed in the environment. And this happens when people come together in any way to invoke God through prayer, through chanting, through meditation, through selfless service. That, of course, the intention for any of these practices is to transform us in a way that we can stop concealing who we truly are, in a way that we can stop concealing our inner innate state as love from ourselves, right? But the side benefit is that we also transmit a frequency of divine power that begins to impact everything and everyone around us. And so the other thing I can tell you, and we know this historically, we don't have to go back that far. We can look at Mahatma Gandhi, we can look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we can look at the movement of Nelson Mandela. These are individuals whose shoulders we stand on because they transformed societies not by returning hatred with hatred, not by seeking revenge, but by returning love for hatred, by returning love for anger. And we have a good number of models of this, frankly, in circumstances that were a lot worse. If we look at apartheid in South Africa and millions of South Africans who all had to have passes that they carried around all the time, were not allowed to go to certain places, and were always at any moment they could be picked up and carted off to prison without any charges, and then they were murdered behind bars. Millions and millions of South Africans were exterminated in this way, mass genocide. And yet Mandela, who led the African National Congress, when he was locked up on Robben Island for 27 years, decided that there was a different approach necessary. And he made the decision to dedicate his life in prison to helping the warden and the prison guards with their personal problems. He began to counsel them spiritually. He began to help them overcome their own suffering. That's how he won his release from prison. And that's how he won the right to be the first president of the free South Africa. So that was through love and reconciliation. This is a being who established a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, committee that was responsible for ensuring that there was a peaceful, loving transition to home rule by South Africans rather than the Dutch Afrikaners. And he created a situation where those who had committed atrocities were allowed to remain in the country to freely roam. All they had to do was to go before the families and admit their wrongdoing. And they were not punished because Mandela didn't see any usefulness in that. The power was in love. And so there's a free South Africa, and we don't hear about this because the media wants to focus on evil rather than love. This is a story that should have been carried all over the world constantly. We should be hearing about that story today. South Africa is one of the very perfect models for this, that they have a country where Afrikaners who were frightened to death of revenge are now able to live in peace side by side with the very people who they persecuted. And so love has always won out in the end, and it's an intrinsic part of our nature. Here's the problem when people say it's too difficult. It's because they're attached to the outcome. When people say to me, how can you expect me to be compassionate? Look at everything I'm having to go through. What's really happening that I've observed is that people have an expectation of an outcome. If I'm compassionate, here's what should happen. And when they start thinking about that outcome, they immediately collapse because they think, well, that outcome is not achievable. And so therefore, there's no, why should I be compassionate? I'm never going to be able, that's too lofty an outcome. This is the problem with compassion, they will say. The problem with not being compassionate is that you're attached to outcomes. And so if you just express compassion, letting go of any expectation of how you want the outcome to look, you will find, and we find, that compassion is such a powerful tool and principle for having people embrace a model for them to easily change. And this is what we're being called upon to do. But it means letting go of outcomes the way we want to see them and simply being focused on expressing God's love for that sake alone, being compassionate without expectations of outcomes. Then it's not hard at all. It's hard because we're attached to an outcome. And if we're compassionate, we say, well, this is the way things should look if I'm compassionate. And then it's too lofty and people say, well, no, that's never going to happen. so there's no way that I can be compassionate. Let go of the outcomes. Compassion is an expression of love that flows quite naturally if we're not attached to outcomes, and then we're better able to express it. And I'm not suggesting, when I say spread love and light, and that's the primary necessity now, we who are more aware spiritually and who have more direct experience of the self, of our God nature, have a responsibility to set the model to be the leadership for those who are less aware. Because the quickest way to change is by modeling after others who have effectively made that change that you're seeking to make. That's the best way to imbibe anything. It's part of life. It's part of how people learn quickly and permanently, is to have a model. And so those of us who are more aware have to first see the innocence and the shortcomings of those who are performing evil deeds. We have to separate the person from the deed, and we have to continually present to those people and others the model that they do not have in their lives for love and light. And the more people insist on presenting this model in any way that you can, you don't have to be a leader of a nation to do this. You can do it in simple acts of kindness. You can do it in having compassion even when you feel you've been wounded. You know, I have this phrase that my guru taught me: compassion coming from a wounded heart is supreme. That's the way in which you can set the model for love and light. You can sit and meditate and encourage others to do so with you, because then you're changing frequencies. You're subtly transmitting the energy of a greater frequency. We have to understand something. To, to change an existing problem, we have to reach for a greater awareness than the one that created the problem. So that's why we need love and compassion. We cannot continue to replicate with the same awareness that created the issue and expect it to change. We have to reach for a greater awareness, a higher spiritual awareness than the one that created the problem, right? And so modeling is the best way, and we need to spread love and light in this way, in whichever way we can, individually and collectively, so that more and more people see that model, rather than the current model that people are following, which is that the majority of people are in fear, and therefore there's no intelligence, and therefore they can't even consider being compassionate, because once the mind devolves into a state of non-intelligence, all of the useless qualities are manifested: revenge, hatred, anxiety, fear, doubt, worry, cynicism, above all, that people become cynical, that there's nothing that can be done, that nothing's ever going to change, that there's evil everywhere you look, which is not true. How can there be evil everywhere you look? Have the trees stopped growing? Has grass stopped growing? Has the sun stopped shining? Has the wind stopped blowing? These phenomena occur due to God's love. So, of course, there's always more love than evil. Evil will never rule over love. We have love all around us. We still have air to breathe. We still can walk in nature. So we need to remember this, and we do have a duty to extend compassion in the fate of hatred, in the fate of harm, in the fate of being, in the face of being transgressed. But I don't mean to say that we should shunt necessary boundaries. So compassion also means responsibility. I started out by talking about this, which means that sometimes tough love is necessary. It means not shunting what we need to do to protect the truth. So, for example, and I never thought this would be the case, but now I'm deeply engaged with a process in the state of Ohio of pushing back on unconstitutional emergency mandates, unconstitutional moves by health departments to strip away our human rights, our civil liberties, and our constitutional rights. And now I'm at the State House talking to legislators. And our school is collaborating with other organizations. We're mounting this very large campaign to take action to protect righteousness, to protect the truth. That's also part of our duty. So no one should say or think that I'm saying that to be loving and compassionate means that we discard these responsibilities. We have a responsibility to protect the truth, to stand for Dharma in the example we set. Otherwise, the useless example will be the one that people embrace because they don't have another one. So this is what I mean by spreading love and light, being compassionate. And sometimes that means that there has to be still boundaries and some tough love, but love should never be left off. It's the only way to spread God's light through the world.